Have you ever found yourself solving a complex problem while your colleagues struggled, only to dismiss it as luck? Or perhaps you have abandoned a project moments before breakthrough because you believed you were not intelligent enough to complete it. In laboratories across the world, neuroscientists have discovered that intelligence manifests in ways most people never recognize in themselves. What if the conventional metrics, IQ tests, academic achievements, career success, are missing the most fascinating dimensions of human cognition? In 1995, Dr. Ellen Langer of Harvard conducted an experiment where participants were given puzzles labeled either intelligence test or game. Those who believed they were taking an intelligence test performed significantly worse than those who thought they were playing a game. The difference was not in their abilities, but in their perception of their abilities. This phenomenon, now known as stereotype threat, reveals something profound. Our intelligence is often masked by our own misconceptions about what intelligence truly is. Consider this. Albert Einstein failed his university entrance exams. Thomas Edison was told by teachers he was too stupid to learn anything. Yet history remembers them as geniuses. What invisible cognitive patterns did they possess that conventional systems failed to capture? And more importantly, what hidden intellectual strengths might you possess that remain unacknowledged, even by yourself? The history of measuring intelligence is fraught with misunderstanding. In 1904, French psychologist Alfred Binet developed the first modern intelligence test to identify students who needed educational support. His intention was benevolent, to help, not to rank or label. However, his creation was quickly repurposed by others into a tool for classification and sometimes discrimination. Lewis Terman, who developed the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale in 1916, believed these tests measured innate intelligence, a fixed quantity determined at birth. Dr. Nina Sharma sits in her neuropsychology laboratory at the University of California, San Diego, surrounded by brain imaging equipment. The greatest misconception about intelligence, she explains, adjusting her glasses, is that it is a single, measurable entity. Modern neuroscience tells us something entirely different. Dr. Sharma has spent 20 years researching cognitive patterns in individuals previously overlooked by traditional intelligence metrics. Her work represents a paradigm shift. Intelligence is not a number. It is a constellation of cognitive processes, many operating beneath our conscious awareness. This view is supported by the groundbreaking work of Howard Gardner, who in 1983 proposed the theory of multiple intelligences, suggesting 8 distinct types: linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. Later, he considered adding existential intelligence to the list. Gardner challenged the notion that intelligence could be captured by a single number. In 2007, researchers at the University of California, Irvine found that the brains of people engaged in different types of thinking showed activation in distinct regions. A mathematician solving equations utilized different neural networks than a poet crafting verses, yet both demonstrated high-level cognitive processing. Traditional intelligence tests primarily measure convergent thinking, the ability to arrive at a single correct answer, explains Dr. Sharma. But divergent thinking, generating multiple creative solutions, is equally valuable and often missed entirely. This raises a profound question. If conventional measures are insufficient, how do we recognize true intelligence, especially in ourselves? What are the hidden signals that might indicate cognitive strengths we have failed to acknowledge? Dr. Aaron Anderson, a cognitive neuroscientist at MIT, provides a compelling framework. Intelligence leaves fingerprints on behavior, thought patterns, and social interactions. Most people simply never learned to recognize these traces in themselves. His research team has identified 7 distinct cognitive signatures that often indicate higher intelligence but frequently go unrecognized by those who possess them. These patterns appear consistently across cultures, age groups, and educational backgrounds, suggesting they may be fundamental aspects of human cognition rather than learned behaviors. The most fascinating aspect, Dr. Anderson continues, is that many people who exhibit these patterns actively deny their own intelligence. They attribute their cognitive abilities to luck, timing, or the contributions of others. This phenomenon was documented in a landmark 1978 paper by Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes, who identified what they called the imposter phenomenon. High-achieving individuals who were unable to internalize their accomplishments and experienced persistent fear of being exposed as frauds. Subsequent research has shown that this pattern disproportionately affects highly intelligent people. But what exactly are these 7 invisible signatures of intelligence? And why do they so often go unrecognized? In 2018, researchers at University College London conducted a study tracking problem-solving strategies across diverse groups. They noticed something peculiar. Individuals who demonstrated the highest problem-solving success rates often abandoned their initial approaches more quickly than others when those approaches proved unproductive. We call this cognitive flexibility, explains Dr. Sharma. It is the capacity to let go of a failing strategy without ego attachment and pivot to a new approach. This mental agility manifests in surprising ways. In one experiment, participants were given a puzzle that appeared to require mathematical calculation but actually needed spatial reasoning. Those who scored highest on measures of cognitive flexibility recognized the need to switch approaches within minutes. Those with less flexibility persisted with unsuccessful mathematical strategies, often becoming increasingly frustrated. The paradox is that cognitively flexible people often interpret their behavior negatively. "I cannot stick with anything," they might say, or "I am too scattered in my thinking." They perceive their mental pivoting as a failure of focus rather than a sophisticated form of adaptive intelligence. Consider the case of Natalie Santos, a 34-year-old software engineer who participated in Dr. Anderson's research. Santos consistently demonstrated exceptional cognitive flexibility in laboratory tests but rated her own intelligence as average at best. "I just try different things until something works," she explained when researchers expressed interest in her problem-solving approach. "I am not smart enough to figure it out the right way the first time." This self-assessment reveals the invisibility of cognitive flexibility to those who possess it. Santos interpreted her ability to rapidly test and discard unsuccessful approaches as evidence of intellectual inadequacy rather than superior mental agility. Neuroscience offers insight into why this cognitive skill remains hidden from self-perception. Functional MRI studies show that cognitive flexibility activates the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, regions associated with executive function but not consciously experienced as intelligence by most people. The historical record is filled with examples of cognitive flexibility leading to breakthrough discoveries. Alexander Fleming noticed that mold had contaminated his bacterial cultures and, rather than discarding them as ruined, investigated why bacteria would not grow near the mold, leading to the discovery of penicillin. His mental flexibility allowed him to see potential where others would have seen failure. Perhaps more revealing are studies of intellectual development in children. Research from Stanford University's psychology department shows that children who demonstrate greater cognitive flexibility at age 5 are significantly more likely to develop innovative thinking patterns by adolescence. Yet when these same children are asked about their problem-solving abilities, they rarely identify flexibility as a strength. "We often mistake cognitive flexibility for indecisiveness," notes Dr. Anderson. But they are neurologically distinct processes. Flexibility is about responsive adaptation. Indecisiveness stems from anxiety or analysis paralysis. This misidentification leads many highly intelligent people to suppress one of their most valuable cognitive assets. They force themselves to persist with failed approaches because they believe that smart people do not give up, when in fact, knowing when to pivot is a hallmark of sophisticated thinking. In 2010, a team of researchers at Yale conducted a series of experiments testing the relationship between actual knowledge and perceived knowledge. They discovered a striking pattern that has since been confirmed by numerous studies. Those with greater expertise in a subject tend to underestimate their knowledge, while those with less expertise tend to overestimate it. This phenomenon, known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, helps explain why truly intelligent people often question their own intelligence. Intellectual humility is not merely modesty, explains Dr. Sharma. It is an accurate metacognitive awareness of the limitations of one's knowledge. This pattern appears across domains. In mathematics, physics, medicine, and other fields, experts are more likely than novices to use phrases like, "I am uncertain," "This is complex," or "We do not fully understand." They recognize the boundaries of current knowledge and the provisional nature of understanding. For many people, this humility becomes an invisible marker of their intelligence. They interpret their awareness of what they do not know as ignorance rather than sophisticated metacognition. Adam Allen, a theoretical physicist at Princeton University, exemplifies this pattern. Despite publishing groundbreaking work on quantum field theory, Allen consistently expresses doubt about his contributions. "The more I learn, the more I realize how little we actually understand," he said in a 2019 interview. "Sometimes I wonder if I am qualified to work in this field at all." Neurologically, intellectual humility correlates with enhanced activity in the anterior prefrontal cortex, a region associated with metacognitive processing and executive function. People with highly active anterior prefrontal cortices are better able to evaluate the quality of their own thinking, leading to more accurate self-assessment. Historical examples abound. Isaac Newton, whose work revolutionized physics and mathematics, famously wrote, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." This sentiment reflects not false modesty but a genuine awareness of the vastness of potential knowledge compared to what any individual can master, a recognition that paradoxically requires considerable intelligence to appreciate fully. Research from the University of Pennsylvania has demonstrated that intellectual humility correlates strongly with scientific thinking, openness to revising one's viewpoints, and the ability to evaluate evidence objectively. Yet because humble individuals focus on what they do not know rather than what they do know, they often fail to recognize these qualities as indicators of intelligence. There's an important distinction between intellectual humility and low self-confidence, notes Dr. Anderson. The former is about recognizing the limits and provisional nature of knowledge. The latter is about doubting one's abilities regardless of evidence. This distinction helps explain why intellectually humble people can simultaneously demonstrate confidence in specific areas where they have expertise while maintaining awareness of the broader limitations of human understanding, a cognitive balancing act that requires sophisticated mental processing. In 2015, researchers at Stanford University conducted a fascinating experiment. They presented participants with controversial political topics and asked them to explain their positions. Those who demonstrated higher intelligence consistently acknowledged multiple perspectives and avoided absolutist language. They used phrases like, "It depends," "There are several factors," and "the evidence suggests," rather than definitive statements. This ability to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory, ideas simultaneously, what F. Scott Fitzgerald called the test of a first-rate intelligence, manifests as comfort with nuance and ambiguity. Yet to many who possess this capacity, it feels like indecisiveness or confusion rather than sophisticated thinking. The human mind naturally seeks certainty and clarity, explains Dr. Sharma. When intelligent people resist this impulse and instead embrace complexity, they often experience discomfort. They mistake their tolerance for ambiguity as evidence of confusion rather than advanced cognition. Neuroimaging studies reveal that navigating complexity activates the default mode network, DMN, in conjunction with task-positive networks, a neural collaboration that was once thought impossible. The DMN, associated with self-reflection and imagination, typically deactivates during focused tasks. However, in people comfortable with nuance and complexity, these networks operate cooperatively. This neural signature correlates with what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to recognize multiple dimensions of an issue and find connections between seemingly disparate perspectives. Nicole Sanders, an environmental policy advisor, demonstrates this pattern in her approach to climate change solutions. People want simple answers: either technology will save us, or we need to transform the economy completely, she explains. But reality is messy. Some technological solutions are promising. Others are distractions. Some economic reforms are necessary. Others might cause more harm than good. Different regions need different approaches. Sanders consistently scores high on measures of integrative complexity, yet she describes herself as always confused about the big picture. She interprets her nuanced thinking as intellectual inadequacy rather than sophisticated analysis. This pattern appears historically in figures like Charles Darwin, who filled notebooks with arguments against his own theory of evolution, or Marie Curie, who continued questioning her discoveries even after receiving Nobel Prizes for her work. Their willingness to engage with complexity rather than retreat to simplicity characterized their genius but also contributed to personal doubt. Research from the University of British Columbia has shown that the capacity for navigating complexity develops with age and education but varies significantly between individuals. Those with the greatest capacity often report feeling less certain about their understanding than those with lower capacity, another example of intelligence hiding in plain sight. Complex thinkers often feel inadequate in environments that reward quick, decisive judgments, notes Dr. Anderson. In meetings or classrooms where rapid responses are valued over nuanced analysis, people who see multiple dimensions of a problem may self-censor or question their intelligence. This cognitive pattern becomes particularly invisible in cultures that prioritize certainty over accuracy. When social rewards flow to those making confident, unambiguous statements, those capable of nuanced thinking may interpret their own hesitancy as intellectual weakness rather than cognitive sophistication. In 2012, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development conducted a study examining how people recognize patterns across different fields of knowledge. They discovered that certain individuals could identify structural similarities between problems in mathematics, music, literature, and social systems, connections invisible to most observers. This cross-domain pattern recognition represents a distinctive form of intelligence that often goes unrecognized, even by those who possess it. To them, these connections seem obvious, so obvious that they assume anyone could see them. When someone says, "This mathematical principle is just like that musical structure which resembles this social dynamic," they are demonstrating sophisticated cognitive processing, explains Dr. Sharma. But because these connections seem intuitive to them, they do not register this ability as special. Neurologically, cross-domain pattern recognition correlates with increased connectivity between brain regions that typically operate independently. The default mode network, task-positive network, and salience network show unusual synchronization in people with this cognitive signature. Alexander Adams, a composer and mathematician, exemplifies this pattern. When teaching composition, Adams frequently draws analogies to mathematical structures. A fugue follows the same logical pattern as a recursive algorithm, he explains to his students. The subject is like an initial function, and the countersubject is like a recursive call with transformed parameters. When researchers pointed out the uniqueness of his cross-domain thinking, Adams appeared genuinely surprised. "Does not everyone see these connections?" he asked. "They are so obvious." This assumption that one's cognitive patterns are universal represents a form of mind blindness in reverse, an inability to recognize that one's mental processes might be unusual or advanced. Because cross-domain thinkers experience their connections as intuitive rather than effortful, they often fail to identify this ability as intelligence. Historically, many groundbreaking insights have emerged from cross-domain pattern recognition. Einstein's thought experiments connecting physics to everyday experiences, Darwin's application of economic principles to natural selection, and Ada Lovelace's connection between weaving patterns and computational algorithms all demonstrate this cognitive signature. Research from the University of Michigan suggests that cross-domain pattern recognition correlates strongly with creative achievement but not necessarily with traditional intelligence measures. This discrepancy helps explain why many innovative thinkers doubt their intelligence despite significant contributions to their fields. We see this pattern frequently in polymaths and Renaissance people, notes Dr. Anderson. They move between domains with a fluidity that confuses specialists, often leading to underestimation of their cognitive abilities by others and by themselves. This cognitive signature becomes particularly invisible in educational systems that compartmentalize knowledge into discrete subjects. Students who make connections between history and biology, literature and physics, or art and mathematics may be perceived as off-topic rather than demonstrating advanced cognitive integration. The ability to recognize patterns across domains represents a form of intelligence particularly valuable in addressing complex, multidisciplinary challenges like climate change, public health crises, or technological ethics. Yet, because these connections often seem self-evident to those who perceive them, this cognitive strength remains hidden from self-awareness. In 2003, researchers at the University of Toronto identified a cognitive pattern they called deep information processing, the tendency to analyze information at multiple levels, examine assumptions, and connect new knowledge to existing frameworks. They contrasted this with surface processing, which focuses on memorization and immediate application without deeper engagement. Deep processors often do not realize they are processing information differently from others, explains Dr. Sharma. They assume everyone else is also analyzing underlying assumptions, questioning methodologies, and connecting concepts across contexts. This cognitive pattern manifests behaviorally in unexpected ways. Deep processors frequently ask questions that others perceive as challenging or unnecessarily complicated. They may seem distracted during conversations when they are actually processing information at multiple levels simultaneously. Neuroimaging studies show that deep processing activates both the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex more extensively than surface processing. This neural signature corresponds to stronger memory formation and more sophisticated conceptual integration. Nadine Sullivan, a history teacher, demonstrates this pattern when reading news articles. While many readers focus on the explicit content, Sullivan automatically considers the historical context, potential biases in reporting, unstated assumptions, and implications for future events. When asked about this approach, she responded, "I am just reading. Is not this how everyone reads?" This assumption that one's cognitive processes are universal represents another way intelligence hides from self-perception. Deep processors often interpret their analytical approach as normal rather than advanced, leading them to underestimate their cognitive abilities. Research from Johns Hopkins University has demonstrated that deep processing correlates with better long-term learning outcomes, more flexible application of knowledge, and greater resistance to misinformation. However, it can sometimes lead to slower initial responses, creating the impression of hesitancy or confusion rather than thorough analysis. Deep processors may seem inefficient in environments that value quick responses, notes Dr. Anderson. They may need more time to thoroughly examine information, leading them to believe they are less intelligent than faster responders, when in fact they are engaging more deeply with the material. Historical examples include figures like Richard Feynman, who insisted on understanding concepts from first principles rather than accepting established explanations, or Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring emerged from connecting seemingly unrelated observations about bird populations and pesticide use over many years. The invisible nature of deep processing becomes particularly problematic in educational settings that reward quick recall over thorough understanding. Students who process deeply may perform worse on timed multiple-choice tests than on assignments requiring analysis and integration, leading them to question their intelligence despite possessing sophisticated cognitive skills. This pattern reveals an important insight about self-perception. We often judge our intelligence by comparing our internal experiences to others' external behaviors, without recognizing that internal processes can differ dramatically between individuals. In 2009, researchers at the University of Oregon conducted a fascinating experiment examining how people respond to constraints in problem-solving. They discovered that certain individuals became more creative when facing limitations, while others became less creative. This pattern, enhanced divergent thinking under constraint, represents another invisible sign of intelligence. Most people assume that constraints inhibit creativity, explains Dr. Sharma. But for some minds, limitations actually stimulate innovative thinking. They see constraints as interesting puzzles rather than obstacles. This cognitive signature manifests in various contexts: limited resources, tight deadlines, strict requirements, or conflicting demands. While many people experience these constraints as stressful and creativity-reducing, others find them intellectually stimulating. Neurologically, divergent thinking under constraint correlates with increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, regions associated with cognitive control and creative problem-solving. These brain areas show heightened connectivity during constrained creative tasks in people with this cognitive signature. Andrew Allen, an architect, exemplifies this pattern. When faced with a challenging project combining tight budget constraints, historical preservation requirements, and sustainability goals, Allen described feeling intellectually alive. His most innovative designs emerged from projects with the most severe limitations. Yet when researchers identified this as an unusual cognitive strength, Allen dismissed it. "I am just doing my job," he explained. "Anyone would adapt to the constraints." This assumption that everyone thrives under constraints represents another way intelligence hides from self-perception. Those who demonstrate enhanced creativity when facing limitations often assume this response is universal rather than a distinctive cognitive strength. Research from Carnegie Mellon University has shown that divergent thinking under constraint correlates with entrepreneurial success, scientific innovation, and artistic achievement. However, it does not necessarily correlate with traditional intelligence measures, creating another disconnection between actual cognitive abilities and self-perceived intelligence. We see this pattern frequently in entrepreneurs and innovators, notes Dr. Anderson. They often describe their breakthroughs as simply working with what we had, rather than recognizing the sophisticated cognitive processing involved in turning constraints into opportunities. Historical examples include the Apollo 13 mission, where engineers transformed disaster into survival by repurposing limited materials in space, or jazz musicians whose improvisational brilliance emerges within strict musical structures. In both cases, constraints became catalysts for creativity rather than barriers to it. The invisible nature of this cognitive signature becomes particularly relevant in resource-limited environments. People who thrive under constraints often attribute successful outcomes to necessity rather than their unique cognitive approach, leading them to underestimate their intellectual capabilities. This pattern reveals something profound about human cognition. The relationship between limitations and creativity is not universal but varies significantly between individuals. For some, constraints represent walls. For others, they become doorways to unexplored possibilities. In 2014, researchers at New York University conducted a series of experiments examining the relationship between intelligence and perspective-taking abilities. They discovered that certain individuals could accurately model others' mental states, including beliefs, knowledge gaps, and assumptions with remarkable precision. This cognitive empathy represents a sophisticated form of intelligence often invisible to those who possess it. Cognitive empathy is distinct from emotional empathy, explains Dr. Sharma. It involves creating accurate mental models of how others think, not just feeling what they feel. This requires complex computational processing in the brain. This cognitive signature manifests in various contexts, explaining complex concepts at different levels for different audiences, anticipating objections or questions before they are raised, or recognizing unstated assumptions in others' arguments. Neurologically, cognitive empathy activates the temporoparietal junction, prefrontal cortex, and parts of the mirror neuron system. These regions work together to simulate others' mental processes, a form of internal modeling that requires substantial cognitive resources. Nora Stevens, a negotiation consultant, demonstrates this pattern when mediating disputes. She can articulate each party's position with such accuracy that participants often express surprise. "She understood my perspective better than I could explain it myself," reported one client. When researchers identified this as an unusual cognitive strength, Stevens appeared genuinely puzzled. "I am just listening carefully," she explained. "Anyone would understand these positions if they paid attention." This assumption that perspective-taking is universal rather than specialized represents another way intelligence hides from self-perception. Those who can accurately model others' mental states often assume everyone else can do the same, interpreting their cognitive empathy as normal rather than advanced. Research from Cambridge University has demonstrated that cognitive empathy correlates with leadership effectiveness, conflict resolution skills, and teaching ability. However, it shows only moderate correlation with traditional intelligence measures, creating another reason why people with this cognitive signature might underestimate their intelligence. We see this pattern frequently in effective teachers, mediators, and team leaders, notes Dr. Anderson. They often attribute their success to people skills rather than recognizing the sophisticated cognitive processing involved in accurate perspective-taking. Historical examples include figures like Abraham Lincoln, whose political genius included a remarkable ability to understand opposing viewpoints, or Mahatma Gandhi, whose strategies demonstrated profound insight into both allies' and opponents' thinking. The invisible nature of this cognitive signature becomes particularly relevant in diverse environments. People with strong cognitive empathy navigate cultural, disciplinary, and ideological differences with less effort than others, often attributing this facility to exposure rather than cognitive ability. This pattern reveals something significant about human interaction. The capacity to model others' minds varies dramatically between individuals. Those with enhanced cognitive empathy possess a form of intelligence that facilitates communication across boundaries but often goes unrecognized as intelligence at all. As we examine these 7 invisible signatures of intelligence, cognitive flexibility, intellectual humility, comfort with complexity, cross-domain pattern recognition, deep information processing, divergent thinking under constraint, and cognitive empathy, a profound revelation emerges. Intelligence is not what most people think it is. The traditional view of intelligence focuses on computational speed, memory capacity, verbal fluency, and logical reasoning. These aspects certainly matter, but they represent only a fraction of human cognitive capability. The 7 invisible signatures reveal a broader cognitive landscape, one that includes metacognitive awareness, adaptive thinking, creative integration, and social cognition. What we are discovering, explains Dr. Sharma, leaning forward intently, is that intelligence is fundamentally about adaptation, not just adaptation to physical environments, but to information environments, social environments, and conceptual environments. This adaptive view of intelligence helps explain why the 7 signatures often remain invisible to those who possess them. Adaptation, by definition, feels natural rather than extraordinary. When we adapt effectively, we rarely notice the process, we simply respond appropriately to the situation. In 2017, researchers at Oxford University conducted a comprehensive study examining how people evaluate their own cognitive abilities. They discovered that people generally judge their intelligence based on 1. Comparison with others in visible tasks. 2. Feedback from authority figures, teachers, employers. 3. Achievement of predetermined goals. 4. Effort required to complete cognitive tasks. 5. speed of reaching conclusions notably absent from this list, metacognitive evaluation of one's adaptive responses to novel or complex situations, precisely where the 7 invisible signatures become most relevant. This misalignment between actual cognitive strengths and self-perception creates what researchers call the hidden intelligence paradox. The tendency of many highly intelligent people to underestimate their cognitive abilities because their particular forms of intelligence operate in ways they cannot easily observe in themselves. Neurologically, this paradox makes sense. The brain regions involved in metacognition, thinking about thinking, are distinct from those that perform primary cognitive processing. We can be exceptionally good at thinking without being equally good at recognizing how we think. Dr. Anderson's laboratory has identified a fascinating neural signature associated with this misperception. When highly intelligent participants were asked to evaluate their performance on complex problem-solving tasks, their anterior cingulate cortex, a region associated with error detection, showed increased activity despite successful performance. Their brains were essentially reporting errors that did not exist. It is as if the brain is hardwired to be skeptical of its own capabilities, Dr. Anderson explains. This may have evolutionary advantages, encouraging continued learning and improvement, but it also leads many people to significantly underestimate their cognitive abilities. This neural pattern helps explain why imposter syndrome disproportionately affects highly intelligent individuals. Their sophisticated error detection systems may be hypersensitive, causing them to perceive flaws in their thinking that others would not notice. The revelation that intelligence often hides from self-perception has profound implications for education, workplace dynamics, and personal development. It suggests that many people abandon pursuits for which they are cognitively well-suited because they misinterpret their own thinking patterns. Consider a student who exhibits remarkable cognitive flexibility but abandons scientific research because she interprets her tendency to switch approaches as evidence of inadequacy. Or a professional with exceptional cross-domain pattern recognition who never pursues leadership roles because he assumes his integrative insights are obvious to everyone. These misalignments between cognitive abilities and self-perception represent a significant loss of human potential. The 7 invisible signatures often remain untapped resources because those who possess them do not recognize their value. The most important insight, says Dr. Sharma, is that intelligence is not a fixed trait but a diverse set of cognitive patterns that manifest differently in different contexts. When people understand this, they can begin to recognize their own cognitive strengths even when those strengths do not match conventional definitions of intelligence. This perspective is supported by recent advances in neuroplasticity research. Studies from Stanford University have demonstrated that intelligence is far more malleable than previously thought. While certain cognitive patterns may have genetic components, all 7 invisible signatures can be developed and strengthened throughout life. This developmental potential creates both opportunity and responsibility. If intelligence can be cultivated, then recognizing and nurturing diverse cognitive patterns becomes an imperative for educational systems, workplace environments, and individuals themselves. The 7 invisible signatures represent not just descriptive categories but potential pathways for cognitive development. By recognizing these patterns, people can cultivate their distinctive forms of intelligence rather than attempting to conform to narrower definitions. The discovery of these 7 invisible signatures of intelligence fundamentally reshapes our understanding of human cognitive potential in several critical domains. Traditional educational systems primarily reward quick recall, procedural accuracy, and standardized test performance. These metrics favor certain cognitive patterns while overlooking others, particularly cognitive flexibility, comfort with complexity, and deep information processing. Our research suggests that up to 40% of students possess cognitive strengths that are largely invisible in conventional classrooms, explains Dr. Sharma. These students often underperform not because they lack intelligence, but because their particular forms of intelligence are not recognized or valued. This misalignment has profound consequences. Students whose intelligence manifests in non-traditional ways frequently develop negative academic self-concepts, leading to disengagement, underachievement, or abandonment of educational pursuits for which they may be cognitively well-suited. Research from the University of Chicago demonstrates that when educational environments are redesigned to recognize diverse cognitive patterns, student achievement increases significantly across all demographic groups. These environments emphasize multiple solution paths, interdisciplinary connections, and metacognitive reflection, approaches that validate the invisible signatures of intelligence. The issue is not just about fairness, notes Dr. Anderson. It is about cognitive efficiency. When educational systems recognize only a narrow band of intellectual expressions, they waste enormous human potential. This wasted potential extends beyond individual outcomes to societal challenges. Complex problems like climate change, public health crises, and technological ethics require diverse cognitive approaches, precisely the kind of thinking that traditional educational metrics often fail to capture. The invisibility of certain cognitive signatures creates significant distortions in workplace evaluation and advancement. Traditional performance metrics often favor visible outputs, speaking confidently in meetings, making quick decisions, producing quantifiable results, while overlooking valuable cognitive processes that may be less immediately apparent. Our research with Fortune 500 companies reveals a consistent pattern, explains Dr. Sharma. Employees who demonstrate cognitive flexibility, deep information processing, and divergent thinking under constraint often create exceptional value, but receive less recognition than colleagues who display more visible forms of intelligence. This recognition gap affects not only individual careers but organizational effectiveness. Companies that promote based primarily on visible performances may elevate individuals with limited cognitive repertoires over those with more adaptive and nuanced thinking patterns. The implications for leadership are particularly significant. Research from Harvard Business School shows that leaders who exhibit the 7 invisible signatures, especially cognitive empathy and comfort with complexity, typically make better decisions in volatile, uncertain environments than those selected for more traditional indicators of intelligence. The VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, requires cognitive patterns that often go unrecognized in standard promotion practices, notes Dr. Anderson. Organizations that identify and cultivate these patterns gain significant advantages in navigating complexity. Some forward-thinking organizations have begun redesigning their evaluation and promotion practices to capture these invisible signatures. They use scenario-based assessments, collaborative problem-solving exercises, and long-term outcome tracking rather than relying solely on conventional metrics. Perhaps the most profound implications of the 7 invisible signatures concern how individuals understand themselves and their potential. When people recognize their distinctive cognitive patterns as legitimate forms of intelligence, they can develop more accurate self-concepts and make better aligned life choices. We have seen remarkable transformations in people who discover that what they previously considered weaknesses are actually cognitive strengths, explains Dr. Sharma. A person who thought they were too questioning recognizes their deep information processing as valuable. Someone who felt indecisive recognizes their comfort with complexity as sophisticated thinking. These reframed self-perceptions can dramatically alter life trajectories. A study from Stanford University tracked individuals who were helped to recognize their invisible cognitive strengths. Compared to a control group, they were significantly more likely to pursue challenging opportunities, persist through difficulties, and ultimately achieve outcomes aligned with their abilities. The psychological mechanisms behind these changes involve what psychologists call attributional retraining, shifting how people explain their experiences from undermining attributions, "I succeeded by luck," to empowering ones, "I succeeded because of my cognitive strengths." This reattribution process can be particularly powerful for individuals from underrepresented groups, who often face stereotype threat, the fear of confirming negative stereotypes about their group's intellectual abilities. Recognizing their invisible signatures of intelligence provides alternative narratives that combat these harmful stereotypes. Beyond these practical applications, the 7 invisible signatures are transforming our scientific understanding of human cognition. They challenge the notion of intelligence as a unitary construct and suggest instead a multidimensional landscape of cognitive patterns that manifest differently across contexts. The evidence increasingly suggests that intelligence is not a thing but a dynamic process, explains Dr. Anderson. It emerges from the interaction between biological predispositions, developmental experiences, and current contexts. This process view of intelligence has profound implications for neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and artificial intelligence research. It suggests that attempts to create artificial general intelligence by replicating narrow computational abilities may be fundamentally misguided. True intelligence, human or artificial, may require the integration of diverse cognitive patterns, including those that have traditionally been overlooked. Recent advances in neuroimaging support this integrated view. Studies using dynamic functional connectivity analysis show that intelligent behavior correlates not with activity in any single brain region but with patterns of synchronization across networks. Different cognitive challenges activate different network configurations, suggesting that intelligence emerges from the brain's ability to reconfigure itself in response to changing demands. What we're discovering, notes Dr. Sharma, is that the brain doesn't have an intelligence center. It has multiple overlapping networks that coordinate differently depending on the task. Some people have greater coordination flexibility than others, a neural signature that corresponds to the behavioral patterns we've identified. This network perspective helps explain why the 7 invisible signatures often co-occur in individuals. They may represent different manifestations of the same underlying neural flexibility. Perhaps most significantly, the 7 invisible signatures have implications for how humanity addresses global challenges. Problems like climate change, pandemic response, and technological disruption require precisely the cognitive patterns that conventional metrics often miss. Comfort with complexity, cross-domain pattern recognition, and divergent thinking under constraint. The challenges we face as a species are not just technical but cognitive, explains Dr. Anderson. They require us to think differently, to integrate perspectives, recognize patterns across domains, and find creative solutions within constraints. This recognition highlights the value of cognitive diversity, not just diversity in backgrounds or viewpoints, but in fundamental thinking patterns. Teams that include individuals with different cognitive signatures consistently outperform more homogeneous groups on complex problem-solving tasks, even when those homogeneous groups score higher on traditional intelligence measures. The invisible nature of certain cognitive patterns creates risk that this valuable diversity will be overlooked or underutilized. When selection processes, whether for educational opportunities, professional advancement, or leadership positions, favor more visible expressions of intelligence, they may systematically exclude individuals whose thinking patterns are precisely what complex challenges require. This isn't just about individual opportunity, emphasizes Dr. Sharma. It's about collective capability. Our research suggests that many of the people best equipped to address our most pressing problems may be overlooked because their intelligence manifests in ways current systems fail to recognize. As our understanding of these 7 invisible signatures deepens, we arrive at a profound realization. Intelligence is not merely what we know or how quickly we process information. It is how adaptively we engage with the world in all its complexity. The traditional narrative of intelligence focuses on academic achievement, test scores, and conventional success. But this narrative misses the cognitive constellations that often matter most. The flexibility to abandon failed approaches, the humility to recognize knowledge boundaries, the comfort with nuance and ambiguity, the ability to see patterns across domains, the capacity for deep rather than superficial processing, the creativity that thrives under constraints, and the cognitive empathy that bridges diverse perspectives. These patterns represent not just alternative forms of intelligence but essential capabilities for navigating an increasingly complex world. They are the cognitive tools that allow humans to address challenges for which there are no predetermined solutions or established expertise. What makes these signatures so fascinating, reflects Dr. Anderson, is that they often operate beneath our conscious awareness. We don't experience ourselves being intellectually humble or cognitively flexible. We simply respond to situations in ways that feel natural to us. This unconscious operation explains why many highly intelligent people fail to recognize their own cognitive gifts. Unlike computational speed or verbal fluency, which produce visible outputs, the 7 invisible signatures manifest as processes rather than products, ways of engaging with information rather than easily measurable outcomes. The invisibility of these signatures creates both challenge and opportunity. The challenge lies in developing systems, educational, organizational, and social, that recognize and nurture these cognitive patterns. The opportunity lies in the vast human potential that might be unlocked when people recognize their distinctive forms of intelligence. Perhaps the most important insight, concludes Dr. Sharma, is that intelligence is not a fixed trait that separates some people from others, but a diverse set of cognitive adaptations distributed throughout the population. Each of us likely possesses some of these patterns in varying degrees. This democratized view of intelligence offers a more hopeful and inclusive vision of human potential. Rather than sorting people into smart and not smart categories, it invites us to recognize the distinctive cognitive contributions each person might make. In the end, the 7 invisible signatures reveal not just how we think, but who we are. They shape how we approach challenges, connect with others, and make sense of our world. By recognizing these patterns in ourselves and others, we gain not just cognitive insight but human understanding. Intelligence, it seems, hides in plain sight, not because it is rare, but because it is diverse, manifesting in patterns we have only recently learned to see.